All right, welcome. We're glad you guys are here today, and all those who are listening in. We know this is a big weekend, uh, and I don't usually do it. I never did, and we did children's church, we would always have special occasions like holidays, and that was the hardest thing for me to do is try to put something together for the holiday. But this kind of fell into place when the Lord had been laying on my heart, and that's today we're going to talk about the value of remembering. And this weekend kind of falls into that category. We call this Memorial Day weekend. And the word memorial in the dictionary it means something established to remind people or persons or remind people of persons or an event. And that's what memorial is all about. Basically, that's what this is that we just did a while ago. The communion that we took was a memorial of what Jesus did for us. The interesting thing about Memorial Day, it commemorates the Americans who died serving in our military. And sometimes we forget that. It was originally called the Decoration Day. But in the early 1970s, it was officially made the last Monday of the month. It used to be May 30th most of the time, which gave you a 3-day holiday. The only bad thing about that is it caused us to lose the meaning and purpose of what this day represents, because now Memorial Day is marked as the first official day of summer, or a 3-day weekend, or barbecues, or celebrations. And I'm not trying to say that this is a bad thing for you guys, so I don't want you to think, oh, we're not supposed to have fun this weekend. No, it's just sometimes, though, we get our perspective on what things are all about. I think we need to remember. This past week or so, we had Decoration Day at the cemetery where my dad is buried. And we went in and we decorated, cleaned it up. And it's not a place where we go and become somber about it, but it's a place where you remember that my dad one time walked upon this earth. He impacted my life. And that's what, Memorial Day should be. It's a time when we remember those things. And it's also a time when we should remember what Jesus did for us, because this is the greatest memorial of all. His blood and his body that was shed for us. And if we don't understand that, then we'll have an issue with, this is just another thing we do. Just like a lot of people think about Memorial Day. It's just a day off, But there is a purpose behind every one of these things that we do. So, Paul kind of gives us an indication of how this, relates to Memorial Day. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 24, it says this. And this is Paul writing to the Corinthian church, but he said, and when he, talking about Jesus, had given thanks, he brake it, talking about the bread, and said, take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. And then he says, this do in remembrance of me. Verse 25 says, and after the same manner, he also took the cup. And when he had supped, saying, this cup is the New Testament in my blood. This do ye, as often you drink it, in remembrance of me. So it's a memorial. That's what this is all about. And that's what we need to remember, what the communion really represents, and not just take it for granted every Sunday we do this. I had a formula that I found and I thought was pretty good. The formula says this: to remember plus understanding equals application. What do I mean by that? In other words, if you remember something and you understand what you remember, you can apply it to your life. Same thing is true about in studies or in school, that if you remember the formulas and you understand it, you can apply it. But if you have one of those out of sorts, you won't be able to apply that. And I think it's important in the Word of God that we understand and we remember things that God has done for us. So I decided today we're going to take a little tour through what Jesus did for us that gave us this memorial. And we're not going to look at the whole story, or we'd be here as long as Daniel could preach, and I'm not going to do that. But we're going to look at the Gospels, and it's found in every Gospel, the story of the crucifixion. And most of you probably have, since what the world calls Easter or Resurrection Sunday was just a few weeks back, most people during that time, they will read that story in the Bible, or they'll watch a movie, or they'll do something that coordinates with that, so you kind of get a little idea. So we're not going to go through all the details, but there's some things I want to point out to you that I think will hopefully help you out. And we're going to look at the book, this story in the book of Luke chapter 23. And we're going to start with verse 26. But before I do that, let me kind of give you a background of where we're going. In Luke chapter 23, the first verse through the fifth verse, Jesus is brought before Pilate. And then in verses 6 through 12, Jesus is brought before Herod. And then in verses 13 through 25, Jesus is brought before the crowd. And then verse 26, the crucifixion begins. But as you read these little overviews, it appears like there's a power show going on. Jesus goes before Pilate. Then it goes Jesus goes back to Herod. And then he's brought before the people. He's a puppet being pushed around. But the truth is, the reason he was going from place to place is because these guys didn't have the guts to do what they knew that they were supposed to do. Pilate didn't want to kill Jesus. He said, I find out, especially as his wife said, you better not touch that man. I had a dream about him. And Herod didn't want to make the decision. And so they all kind of pushed it aside. But the religious leaders are saying, we want him crucified. So Pilate does the thing that's so noble. He goes and washes his hand like that's going to clear him and says, I'm not having no part of this. It's yours. So it was kind of like a bunch of whiny baby leaders that wouldn't stand up for what they knew was right. But we're going to pick this up in verse 26 because this is where it starts after Pilate washed his hands. And then we're going to just see what happened here. So in verse 26, I'm going to read through verse 43, so bear with me as we read this. As they led him, talking about Jesus, away, they laid hold upon one Simon, a Cyrenian, coming out of the country. And on him they laid the cross, that he might bear it after Jesus. And there followed him a great company of people and of women, which also bewailed or lamented. That word also means mourning and wailing over him. And Jesus, turning unto them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, or you could say it this way, this is certain, the days are coming in which they shall say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bare, and the paps or the breasts that never gave suck or nursed. Then shall they begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things, or you can say it this way, if such things were done in the green or the living tree, what shall be done in the dry? And there was also 2 other malefactors or criminals led with him to be put to death. And or so when they came to the place which is called Calvary, they crucified him. And the malefactors are one on the right hand and the other on the left. Then said Jesus, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, or they don't know what they're doing. And they parted his raiment, or they divided his clothes, and they cast lots, or you could say they threw dice, trying to win Jesus' clothes. Verse 35, and the people stood beholding, and the rulers also with them derided or ridiculed him, saying, He saved others, let him save himself, if he be Christ, the chosen one of God. And then the soldiers also mocked him, coming to him, offering him vinegar or sour wine, and saying, If thou be the king of the Jews, save thyself. And a superscription or an inscription was written over him in letters of Greek and Latin and Hebrew. And it read this: This is the King of the Jews. Verse 39, and one of the malefactors which hanged railed on him, saying, If thou be the Christ, or the Messiah, save thyself and us. But the other answered, rebuked him, saying, Dost not thou, or don't you fear God, seeing that thou art in the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing amiss, or nothing wrong. And he said unto Jesus, Lord, remember me when thou comest into or in thy kingdom. And verse 43 says this, And Jesus said unto him, Verily I say unto thee, or I tell you the truth, today thou shalt be with me in paradise. Paradise being a place of the abode of the righteous dead, and people died, that's where they went. And he said that. Now this was an interesting story, and like I said, we all know the story of the crucifixion, most of us did. And I'm not going to go into any gory details, because there's movies out and there's stories out that, and sometimes preachers preach it, they kind of make it as gory as they can because that's what people want to hear. But we all know that Jesus suffered. He suffered mentally, he suffered physically, and he was ridiculed and challenged if you say who you are. And it's just amazing what he went through, and he did it for us. But when I read this is what I came up with. In this story, the part that I just read, there are actually 4 people groups that are involved in this crucifixion. Now, they did not go and actually crucify Jesus himself, but they were part of it. And they became participants in the crucifixion. We're going to look at these 4 people groups. The first one is Simon the Cyrenian. Now, and we find this in verse 26, where he says, read it again, look at it again. And as they, talking about the Roman soldiers, led him, talking about Jesus, away, they laid hold upon him, or they seized one Simon, a Cyrenian, coming out of the country. And on him they laid the cross, that he might bear it after Jesus. Now you read this, you think, well, who was this guy? Who is this Simon the Cyrenian? Well, there's some things we know about him, and there's some things we don't know, and there's some things that you kind of speculate about him. And that's kind of what you do, everybody, right? You know some things, and some things you don't know about them. So you just make up your own decision about it. Well, I'm going to try not to make up lies about this guy, but here's some things I think we need to know. Here's what we do know about him. He was from Cyrene, which is northern Africa, which today we would call Libya. And the second thing it says in this scripture, he was coming out of the country. And we're not really sure what that means. Some say perhaps he was coming out of his field. Others say he was coming from outside the city. But what we don't know for sure is why he was there. We don't know, perhaps he was there to celebrate the Passover. Or perhaps he was there to witness the crucifixion. We don't know. But there's another thing that we do know about this guy, but not from Luke's perspective, but from Mark, that he was a father of 2 sons. And we don't know this unless you go to the book of Mark, which actually picks this up. In Mark chapter 15 and verse 21, this is what Mark says. He says, And they compel or force one Simon, a Cyrenian, who passed by, coming out of the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. So you read that and you think, well, what do those 2 guys have to do? It's like John Mark was saying, okay, they picked up Simon, Rufus and Alexander's father. So these people, somebody knew who this guy was, and they knew these kids. But it don't really tell us that. But evidently the people who, when Mark was writing this, that audience had some clue maybe to who they was. Now I'm going to give you one clue. I'm not sure it's true, but it'll give you something to think about, that maybe this Rufus was actually became a follower, a disciple of Christ, because in Romans chapter 16, Paul was finishing his sermon in Romans and writing the letters like he always does, and he closes out with salutations. And this is what he says in verse 13. It says, "Salute Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother and mine," or you could say, who was also a mother to me. So we don't know if this was the same Rufus or not, but we do know one thing: there's not a lot of Rufuses in the Bible. There were Simons, there was Marks, there was Peters, but I don't see very many Rufuses. I don't see very many Rufuses today. Matter of fact, there was a football player for OU, Rufus Alexander, was a great player. So, but anyway, this is it. And then there's another indication that maybe Alexander, the other son was mentioned, is the one mentioned in Acts when they had the riot in Ephesus, and he was trying to calm the people down. Don't know none of that. All we can do is speculate. Maybe that was him. Maybe this thing that Simon did impacted his kids, and they became followers of Christ. We don't know that. Here's my opinion, though, about Simon. Simon had a better understanding about what Jesus was going through than anyone else there that day. And here's why. He had an understanding of what that lonely march to Golgotha really meant, because he had to do it. He experienced it. He had an understanding of the relentless pressure of a burden that was not his own. This wasn't his crucifixion, but he's having to carry the cross. So he understood taking another's burden, which is exactly what Jesus was doing that day. He was taking our burdens. It wasn't his, but he took it. So Simon had an understanding that most of us in America don't even understand what Jesus did. It goes on to say also he had an understanding about the pain of another. So he understood because he was seeing the pain Jesus was going through. But Jesus understood that, and that's why he took the pain for us. Simon also had an understanding of the suffering of another's hurt. He was carrying a cross for somebody who was hurting. Jesus was carrying that cross for people who were hurting, like us. And he had an understanding of the weight of taking another's burden off somebody's shoulders. And that's what Jesus was doing that day. He was carrying a burden, not of his own, but of others, of you and me. He was doing that. Now, to Simon, if he was like most modern Christians today, he would chalk this experience up as a rude interruption to his plans. You know, because he didn't come there to carry a cross. We don't know why he came there, but it sure wasn't to do that. But remember my equation I gave you a while ago. To remember plus understanding equals application. So if this Simon, you know he was not going to forget what he went through that day. And if he understood what went on, maybe he did apply that to his life. And maybe his sons did follow his footsteps. Maybe his sons did become disciples. Maybe that is Rufus in Romans that we see that was his son. Maybe that is Alexander, his son, who tried to stop the riot in Acts. We don't know. But we do know this, that if you remember things and you understand what you're remembering, you can apply it to your life. But if you don't, you won't. So we find this first person in this people group, in the crucifixion, Simon the Cyrenian. The next group we're going to look at is a group called a great company of people, or spectators. Or I want to do add a little bit more to that. I'm going to call them the many. Now, I don't know how many of you guys remember, Brother Daniel gave us a handout to read scriptures about the few and the many. Well, this is a good example of the many right here. Great company of people. whenever you're in the crowd, you feel like you're a part of it. But the crowd's not always right. Let's pick it up in verse 27 of Luke. It says, and there followed him a great company of people. And he breaks it down and gives a little bit of insight to who some of these people were in this great company. And one of them was the women, which also bewailed and lamented, or mourning and wailing over him. So we have in this group of many, he breaks it down and he mentions the women in there. And we're going to pick that up in verse 28, because the women were part of that great company. In verse 28, Jesus says this, but Jesus turning to them said, daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. Basically what he was saying there is because judgment is fixing to come upon this nation. Now, you kind of wonder when I read this, how he did this, because he was carrying a cross. How did he have a conversation with these women and who these women were? So he comes up and he addresses them as daughters of Jerusalem. And I don't believe that these were the regular women followers of Jesus, because they're mentioned later. Matter of fact, Janice, I didn't give you this verse, but in Luke chapter 23 and verse 49, there is a mention of maybe those who've actually followed Jesus closely. And this is what it says. It says, and all of his acquaintance and the women that followed him from Galilee stood afar off. So they weren't up there by Jesus when he was carrying the cross. It said, stood afar off, beholding or saw these things. So we have these women who probably weren't the actual followers of Jesus, but they were up there, and they were moaning and wailing. Some say they were probably professional mourners, which is a big deal back there. And I don't know, and if they were professional mourners, that means they got paid, and my question was, who paid them? And who hired these women to do that? But Jesus had a message for them. And if you're not careful, you get this as a condemning message to these women. But he wasn't condemning these women. He was bringing judgment upon a nation. But look, verse 29, it says this. Okay, you're going to continue what he said. He said, the judgment coming upon the nation. Verse 29 says, for behold, or I like to say it this way, this is certain. The days are coming in which they shall say, blessed are the barren. Now, normally in the Bible, when barrenness represented a sign of judgment, but Jesus is telling these daughters of Jerusalem, you're blessed if you're barren. Why is that? Because he goes on and reads, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bare and the paps or the breasts that never gave suck or nursed. Why was he saying that? Well, first of all, he was stopping these women because I think their mourning could have easily turned Jesus' focus on himself and how bad it was. Because it was bad. It was a bad thing to have to go through what he was going through. And he knew that if he didn't stop it, the focus was going to be upon him, and he would miss his mission or his hour. You remember we talked about that in John. Jesus said, my hour has not yet come. Well, this is it. This is the hour that he was talking about. It came. That's what it is. It was taking place right now. And he wanted to make sure that focus did not come back on him, but he was finishing the purpose he was called to do. So Jesus turns the mourning and the wailing into a prophetic warning of disaster. And what we're reading here was the second of two warnings. And we'll stop that because, like I said, this is part of why we remember communion. We have to see every detail that Jesus went through. And so there was a warning given to the daughters of Jerusalem, but there was a warning also given to the whole city of Jerusalem. And in Luke chapter 19, I want you to see this. In verse 41, Jesus is coming into Jerusalem. And this is what it says. And when he, talking about Jesus, was come near or approached, he beheld the city or Jerusalem, and he wept over it. And look what he said, saying, if thou hadst known, even thou, at least in this thy day, or on this day, the things which belong unto thy peace, or that make for your peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. Verse 43, for the days will come upon thee, and thine enemies will cast or build a trench. Actually, that word means an embankment, because back in those days, when you wanted to go after a city, the only way you could get it, you had to get over the walls. So they began to pull all kinds of embankments, if they had to bring dirt or whatever it is, or ladder, whatever, because they knew if we ever got inside the wall, we could take it over. And he says, in those days they're going to build a trench or an embankment about thee, and compass thee round, and keep thee in every side. And they shall lay thee or demolish you, even to the ground, and thy children with thee, or thy children within your walls. And they shall not leave thee one stone upon another. The Greek says there will not be leave a stone on stone, because thou knewest not the time of thy visitation, or the visitation from God. This was fulfilled in around AD 70. So this was the first warning that Jesus gave, a prophetic warning. And then now we're reading back in where we're at with the daughters of Jerusalem, the second warning he's given. And basically this warning is a warning that motherhood will be cursed instead of a blessing. And he was revealing to them that there's a far greater reason for tears for them than the tragedy he seemed to be going through at that time. But it was not about himself. And this is something we need to understand. Jesus never thought about himself when he was going through all of this. It was about them. So when he turned and told these ladies, he was not trying to put them down. He was trying to say, this is a warning. It's coming. And I'm concerned about you. I'm concerned about you. It was the same thing he said to his disciples on the Mount of Olives before all this took place, when he went there to pray. A lot of people read that, when Jesus was praying. We're going to look at it and think he got mad at his disciples. But he wasn't really angry because they weren't praying with him. He was angry because he wanted them to know there was an urgency. In 1997, my father passed away with cancer. It was a rough time, too, during that time, because we was praying for his healing. And he didn't get healed. He died. And I remember when this all happened, it was a struggle for me, because I knew, I thought, I prayed for this, and I just, and it didn't happen. And I was thinking about my mom. She's alone now. So I got to be the big boy, and I got to stand up and help her. And it was all this is going through answers and questions that you could not figure it out. And I remember one morning sitting in my kitchen, about 5 o'clock in the morning, I'd gotten up and I was praying. And this is what I prayed. I said, God, just give us normalcy in our family again. And it was just like God spoke in the clear air. He said, Rick, I'm not looking for normalcy in your family. I'm looking for an urgency in your family. That stuck with me like glue. God is not concerned about normalcy in your life, guys. He's looking for an urgency, because the time is getting close to an end. And if we don't have an urgency about it, he's going to get a little ticked at us. He did to the disciples. Let's read this. In Luke chapter 22 and verse 39, it says this, and he, talking about Jesus, came out, and he went, or he made his way as he was wont, or as he was custom. In other words, he was accustomed to going to the Mount of Olives to pray. So this wasn't a new thing for Jesus to do. So he was accustomed to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples also followed him, because I think the disciples figured out Jesus goes through some things that we don't seem to be going through, so maybe we need to do what he does. Let's go to the Mount of Olives and pray with him. Verse 40 says this, and when he was at the place, which is Gethsemane, he said unto them, pray that ye enter not into temptation. Now, what was the temptation he was talking about there? What was Jesus telling these guys? Don't fall into temptation. Well, the temptation he was talking about was a challenge that was fixing to come before him, a challenge for them to defect, to them to desert, like Judas did, and like Peter was fixing to do. He was saying, guys, you have better get ready, because temptation is coming your way for you to fall away, for you to run off, for you to leave. And he was asking, don't let that happen. Verse 41 says, and he was withdrawn from them about a stone's cast, and he kneeled and he prayed, saying, Father, if thou be willing, remove or take away this cup, which that cup we're talking about there alludes to the wrath of God. He said, take this away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine or yours be done. And there appeared an angel unto him from heaven, strengthening him. He needed that at that time, because he knew what was fixing to come, coming down the road. And being in agony or anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like it were great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And when he rose from the prayer and was come to his disciples, he found them sleeping for sorrow. Some translations say they were exhausted from grief. They heard a lot of bad news, man. They had heard that Jesus got with them, so I'm fixing to die. I'm fixing to be crucified. And then they heard the stories that, hey, some of you are going to betray me. So they was going through all the trying to figure it out. They was trying to find normalcy. Let's get back to normal, Jesus, the way it was when we had all this good stuff happening, all the signs and the wonders, and everybody liked you. But Jesus, that's not the place here. So he arose and he found them sleeping. And verse 46 says, and said unto them, why sleep ye? Rise and pray, lest you enter into temptation. Another translation says that Jesus calls his disciples again to prayerful watchfulness. He was saying, get up and pray, for the time is full of danger. Boy, somebody ought to tweet that, because that's where we're at, folks. We need to be getting up and praying, for the time is full of danger. You say, well, what do you mean by getting up and praying? Maybe we need to get up a little bit earlier and pray, because the time's full of danger. He was telling us he was not mad at them because they weren't praying for him. He was concerned about their urgency with what was coming down, and they weren't going to be ready for it. He said, guys, you need to be praying. So when temptations are coming your way and you fall for it, maybe you should stop and look at your prayer life. Because evidently the way Jesus talked, your prayer life can eliminate, or not eliminate, but can help you in a situation when temptations are bigger than you are. And let me just tell you, the devil doesn't play fair. He brings big temptations when he can do it, trying to overwhelm you. Meanwhile, back to the daughters of Jerusalem. In verse 30, he goes on and he says this to them. Remember, he's talking to them. He's not angry with them. He wasn't angry with his disciples. A lot of us modern Christians want to say, man, he was so mad at those disciples. And I used to say the same thing. And because they were lazy bums, they should have been praying. He wasn't doing that. He was more saying, man, you guys need to be praying for yourself, not for me. And he was saying the same thing to these daughters of Jerusalem. Don't be wailing and crying over me. You better think of yourself. Verse 30 says, then shall they begin to say to the mountains. He's still prophesying over them. In other words, appealing to creation in itself to hide them from God's wrath. Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. What was he saying there? He was telling those people, those women, there's going to be a time when people will feel that they are better off dead. That's what he said. There's going to be a time when people are going to say, I will be better off dead than alive, because it's going to get so bad. Folks, we're at that time. We look around in this world today, in this nation especially, and we see mass shootings going on. And it seems like when they get through shooting, then they turn the gun up on themselves and kill them. They have to be thinking in their head, I will be better off dead. The sad thing is, when they pull that trigger, they're going to say, that was a mistake. And we're in that place. We're in that place where people think the way out is death. Jesus said that time is going to come. It came to those people, and we could be in that same situation in our nation or in the world that, there's no hope. So let's just kill ourselves. Jesus was prophesying and said, quit crying for me. You need to cry for yourself. And then verse 31, he goes on and says, if they do these things, or if such things are done in a green or a living tree, what should be done in the dry? What was he talking about there? He was comparing the judgment of himself as a green living wood versus a worse judgment that was going to come upon a dry, dead wood of that nation. Now, you know the story. I mean, if you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that green wood doesn't burn as fast as dry wood. So Jesus was the green wood. And he said, what I'm going through is tough, but the dry wood is going to be even tougher because there's no way you're going to be able to stop it. So he was talking to the people, and the great number of people. That was the women, the daughters of Jerusalem. And then he moves on to and identifies one more group of people in this section of the great number of people, or the many. And that was the rulers. The rulers. And we find that in verse 35. And it says this, and the people stood beholding, and the rulers also with them derided or ridiculed him, saying, he saved others, let him save himself, if he be the Christ, the chosen of God. My question was always, who are these rulers? I mean, you can just throw rulers at it. Who are we talking about? Well, thank God for Matthew, because Matthew gives us a little insight of who these rulers were. If you go to Matthew chapter 27, here's his take on who these rulers were. In verse 41, Matthew says, likewise, also the chief priest, mocking him, and the scribes and the elders said, so they were the ones, they were considered the rulers, the chief priests, the scribes, which would be like lawyers, and then we got the elders, which would be like over cities or whatever. This was the ruling body. And let me just say what this ruling body wanted more than anything else. They tried to impress man rather than God. Now remember, these guys were ordained by God. I mean, God ordained chief priests. He ordained the scribes and elders. That was part of his plan. But they had turned it around and turned it upside down. Kind of like today. How many of y'all believe we live in an upside down world? Yeah. I mean, things are just topsy-turvy right now. But in this case, they were too. Because they were trying to impress man rather than God. Why would they do that? Why would they want to impress man rather than God who gave them this authority? 3 reasons. For gain or money, for power, and for the praise of man. That was why they did it all. Hello, America. All right. Some say that it's doubtful that these rulers would ridicule their enemy in public, because that would be conduct unbefitting, even though it says here that they were doing it. But how many of you know that sometimes conduct is not always befitting? And I think we can see in our world today, we see people who we should respect for what their offices are or what positions they hold, and they have done things that was just not very professional, unbefitting. So it can happen. You get caught up in a situation, and they can turn things around. And this is what I think what happened here. But this is what they did. They challenged him, said, if you be the Christ, the chosen one, Come down and show us that that's who you are. What they were doing, they were challenging him to save himself from the cross when he was actually saving others by the cross. So he was doing the thing that he was supposed to do because this was his hour. So we have Simon the Cyrenian, and then we have the great crowd of people, the many, which we pulled out a couple in there that Jesus was pinpointed, and that was the daughters of Jerusalem and the rulers. But look at the third people group there, the two criminals. There were two criminals involved in this crucifixion. They were part of the puzzle. And they were part of the puzzle because they was the fulfillment of a prophetic message back in Isaiah 53. But in Mark chapter 15, verse 28, before we read about it, this is what he said about these two criminals. And the scripture was fulfilled, which said, he was numbered with the transgressors, or with the criminals. In other words, Jesus, they made him a part as a criminal. They painted the picture that he was the criminal. And we find that in verse 32 of Luke 23, and this is what it says, and there was also two other, I notice they put that in a two other, like Jesus was too, two other malefactors or criminals. And he led him to be put to death. Verse 33, and when they had come to the place which is called Calvary, they crucified him. Let me just say something about crucifixion back to the Romans. They usually reserve crucifixion. What everybody in that time was not crucified if they was lawbreakers. This is basically set aside for people who was guilty of treason or some kind of political thing and trying to take over. So, that would be the first ones that they would. That's what crucifixion was set up for. Now, others got crucified, but that's what crucifixion during the Roman times was set up to get those people who were troublemakers in our kingdom and try to bring down our kingdom and our leadership. So it says, and they crucified him with the malefactors, one on the right hand and the other on the left. And here's another interesting tidbit of history, that whenever Rome would crucify more than one person, in this case 3, they would always put the most violent criminal in the middle cross. So what they were doing, they was labeling Jesus and let the crowd see it. He is the mean one. He is the violent one. Those other guys are bad, but there's the man. He's the one that you want to focus on because he is a bad dude. And that's why they crucified. That's why they put him in the center. Verse 39, let's go down and read it. And one of the malefactors which hanged railed on him, saying, if thou be the Christ or the Messiah, save thyself and us. Verse 40, this is an interesting guy here. But the other answering rebuked him, saying, the Greek says it this way, but answering the other rebuked him and said, dost thou not fear God, seeing that thou art in the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds. But this man hath done nothing wrong. Then he said unto Jesus, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. And he, Jesus, said unto him, verily I say unto thee, today thou shalt be with me in paradise. So we got these two criminals. One of them joined in and railed against him with the crowd, with the many. But the other one rebuked that railer. And as I began to look at this, I thought, why did this guy do that? What made this guy turn? And I looked at 3 sayings that he spoke while he was on the cross. And I think they're interesting to look at. In verse 40, he says this, dost not thou fear God? Or don't you fear God? I love this translation I found on that verse. And this is what it says in the translation. It says, you should fear God and not speak. That would be a good tweet, wouldn't it? You should fear God and not speak. If people followed that, there would be no social media because people would not be speaking anymore, but they think they got to get on there and say something, right? But if we fear God, we keep our big mouth shut. And that's what he was telling this guy next to him or on the other side. Hey, you should fear God and not speak. In verse 41, he goes on and says, but this man hath done nothing wrong. How did he know that? How did he know what Jesus had done and not done? Was he familiar? Maybe he heard the stories. Maybe for when he was being crucified, he thought, boy, I'm being crucified with the best. I've heard about this guy. He's famous. I don't know. But he said, he has done nothing wrong. Well, here's my question. What impacted that thief to rebuke the other one? And here's my conclusion to that. Are you ready? Remember, he was a captive audience. He wasn't going nowhere. He was hanging on a cross just like Jesus. So, he was hearing everything that Jesus was saying. What would make a guy turn around all of a sudden? He was hearing all the words of Jesus. Well, Romans chapter 10, verse 17 says this, so then faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word or the priest's word of God. Most people put that as the word of Christ. Here he was, hanging on the cross, and what was he doing? He wasn't going nowhere. He was listening to what Jesus said. He was listening. So maybe faith came because he was listening and hearing. And he was seeing the reaction also to everything that was being said and done to Jesus. But what did Jesus say that maybe turned him around? Verse 34. Then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. Here was that thief hanging on the cross, seeing everything they did to Jesus and hearing him. And instead of Jesus fighting back, he says, forgive them, God. They don't know what they do. And you think, well, once Jesus said that, everything was over. It's going to get better because he did the right thing, right? But they continued to pile on him. And this thief was seeing that because in verse 36 it says, the soldiers then mocked him, coming up to him and offering him vinegar or sour wine, and saying, if thou be the king of the Jews, save yourself. And then verse 38, you got to see this, man. In verse 38, here's the thief hanging on the cross, hearing what Jesus is saying, seeing what they're doing to him. And then he sees this sign up there over Jesus' head. And it says, this is the King of the Jews. Why is that important? And the Bible said it was written in Greek, it was written in Latin, and it was written in Hebrew. They wanted everybody that was there to understand what this guy was there for. Because you see, when they put those signs up, that was the accusation. It's an important detail we need to understand, and everybody else knew there that day. The reason Jesus was executed is because he claimed to be a king. And Rome said, no way. We only have one king. Now think about this just a minute, folks. For years, the Pharisees, the religious group, was trying to kill Jesus, arrest him. They tried to do it through blasphemy. They tried to do it through all these other things. They even thought about stoning him. But they finally found the thing they were looking for that got him arrested. And that's when they told everybody he said he's a king. Got Rome's attention. Because Rome said there's only one king, only one leadership in this nation. And when they said he's a king, that was what they needed. Arrest that dude. And the Pharisees had thought they'd done a great job. And they arrested him, and they had him convicted, and they finally brought him to the cross. But there was this thief hanging on the cross beside him, hearing what they were saying to him, and hearing his response back to them, seeing what they were doing to him, and then looking up at that big sign. It says, this is the King of the Jews. And then verse 42, he said, remember me, talking to Jesus, when thou comes into your kingdom or your future kingdom. You know what he was saying there, guys? He was saying, I know you are a king. Because when he asked him, remember when you come to the kingdom, you have to be a king to have a kingdom. He heard all the rigmarole out there in the audience saying, if you were the king, if you were that. And he saw the sign up there. And it dawned on him, this is the king. This is him. It was a statement of faith. He didn't get up and pray the sinner's prayer to get in heaven. He didn't even get up and get to follow Jesus as his disciple. But it was his faithfulness. He understood. Faithfulness first showed up. That's when he rebuked the other thief. It dawned on him, this guy is who they say he is. And then he goes on and says, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He was hoping for a future kingdom when Jesus would come into his kingdom. But Jesus gave him more than he asked for. Because here was Jesus' reply. Verily I say unto you, or I tell you the truth, today you will be with me in paradise. Not in the sweet by and by, but today. That's the way my Jesus works. He gives you more than you ask for if you put your trust in him. You know, we got to compare this, how Jesus really worked, because sometimes you say, well, that was one story. Well, let's look at another story that we all should be familiar with. And that was when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. And Daniel already talked about that. But I love what Jesus did to Martha. In John chapter 11, verse 23, Jesus talks to Martha, and Jesus said unto her, thy brother shall rise again. And Martha said to him, I know that he'll rise again in the resurrection in the last day, in the future, in the sweet by and by, Jesus, he's going to rise again. Everything, blessed be the name of the Lord. Verse 25, Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. And he that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he come to life. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this? In other words, he is going to come to life today. Because that's what I am. That's the same thing he told that thief. When that thief died that day on the cross, where do you think he went? He went to paradise, or Jesus was a liar. And I don't believe Jesus is a liar. So Jesus was pretty much saying this back to this guy. I am that king, that you know who I am. I am him. So we have three people that we've seen in this story. That's Simon the Cyrenian, the great company of people, or the many, and the two criminals. There's one more we have to look at. The soldiers. We pick it up in verse 36. It says, and the soldiers also mocked him, coming to him and offering him vinegar. That word vinegar means sour wine. It's actually a Latin word. It was a cheap wine called Posca. And it was really, I think it was wine that those soldiers drink. So it must have been pretty watered down that they would be able to do that. And he goes and said, and saying, they was offering him that, and they said, if thou be the king of the Jews, save thyself. So they joined in the derision of the ridicule, and they offered him wine, which he refused. Now some thought when they offered him that wine, that was further act of torture. And some thought it was a form of cruelty that would prolong his life and he would suffer longer on the cross. And there were some who mistaken it as an act of kindness. Some thought it was a merciful custom to deaden the pain, so that's why they gave it to him. But let me just say one thing. There was nothing merciful or kind about crucifixion. So I don't believe they were trying to be nice to Jesus. It was one of the most cruelest forms of punishment practiced by the Romans. Matter of fact, Roman historian Cicero called it a cruel and disgusting penalty. Josephus, the Jewish historian, said it was the worst of deaths. So it wasn't a walk in the park that Jesus was doing. So we have the four people groups that was mentioned there. the Simon the Cyrenian, and then we have the other ones, the great company of people, the criminals and the soldiers. Now I want to just kind of finish this up here, but just say, well, what does that have to do with us? Well, I got to look this through, and I kind of see pictures of those people living in today's society. Let me just kind of give you an example, and you guys can think about this. First of all, Simon the Cyrenian, I think, could be a picture of modern Christianity. He became part of the crucifixion, though, but he didn't come there for that. I don't believe he came there to pick up Jesus' cross. But he got caught off guard. And then he got intimidated. Think that happens in the world today? You think we as Christians can get caught off guard? You think we can be intimidated by things, this culture? Yeah. So he knew that. That's why Peter said in 1 John 5:8-9, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom or someone he may devour. Whom resist? Steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same afflictions are completed in your brethren. So we have this group of people, or a man, by the name of Simon, that we could see fitting into maybe the church. We don't know. How about the great company of people? How would they compare to us today? Oh, I think they would be a picture of the culture of our times. The culture is a powerful force. It was then, it is now. It influences what a person believes and how a person behaves. So the culture became part of the crucifixion of spectators. They may not have felt like this was right, but they did nothing about it. They felt like they couldn't make a difference because everybody else was doing it. So this was the crowd of people that we see there. Today's culture is, well, it's empowered through three things. I call it the 3 Ds of our culture that will empower. Number 1 is deception. Number 2 is distraction. And number 3 is discouragement. This culture that we're living in today, in America I'm talking about, is very deceptive. It wants to make you believe things that aren't right. It wants to make you believe things that are upside down. It makes you to believe, okay, because they are deceiving you. And they distract you, kind of like a magician, over here, he's doing all this stuff, and the trick is right over here. And that's what this culture does. It distracts you by showing you stuff. Oh, man, look how bad this is over here. And things are getting worse over here. And they do it through discouragement, like you don't have a chance. You might as well just give up. Maybe you need to go get a gun and kill yourself because there's no hope left. This is the culture. This is what the culture can do. And so I see the people that was crucified or there watching the crucifixion is a picture of our culture. Matter of fact, Matthew said, or Jesus said it this way, Matthew 26:41, watch and pray that you enter not into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. That's the culture. Then we have the third group, the criminals. Who are those criminals? How would we relate to criminals today? Well, they would be the heathen. Probably one of the most likely to follow Jesus, but at the time they're not. I mean, look at this criminal. We had 2 criminals. One of them turned his life around on the cross. But here's the criminals. The word criminal there is a Hebrew word which means a robber, a rebel, or gang members. And what these people were doing, the definition of them is they would violently ambush unsuspected people. Hello. Did you see that happening in America's world today? All of a sudden you got this group of people who decide to go in and take over everything in the store or take over a community, do whatever they can do. That's what these criminals represented. But something we need to see here. Do we hate them? Jesus didn't hate that criminal. He listened to him. He showed him a way. See, and you say, well, these guys were just, they weren't bad. They were just thieves. No, Romans commonly crucified violent men. So these guys had some kind of violence. They didn't regularly crucify just somebody who was a pickpocket or something like that. So these two criminals were violent. Well, here's another thing about these criminals, though, you need to understand. They were not part of the religious or the government groups. They were not influenced by religious leaders, nor were they threatened by Roman authority. They did their own thing. But the one joined in with the crowd and started taunting Jesus. That may have been the reason that one criminal was a criminal, because he followed the lead of others instead of making his own choice. But the one was more open to the truth. And then the last people group that we can see in our world today is the soldiers. This could be a picture of a group of men who have no respect for persons or things. The only loyalty they have is to their military leadership and no other. And what I mean by that, they did not let religion influence them in any way, and neither did they let politics. They were a man that they listened to their leader and no other. And we have people in this world today like that. Matthew chapter 6, Jesus says this, no man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. And you think about that. That's exactly how the focus that these soldiers had. Hey, I am not going to serve this Jesus and the leadership and who we follow. So that's why they made a sport of Jesus, the one who claimed to be a king. And they flogged him severely to the point of almost death because he was accused of being a king. And they said, no, we just got one leader. Nobody else. We're going to follow them. So these are the four people groups that maybe exist in our world today. The good news is, and it's kind of refreshing, that we can't crucify Jesus again. Or can we? The writer of Hebrews says we can. In Hebrews chapter 6, verse 4 says this, for it is impossible for those who once were enlightened and have tasted the heavenly gift and were made partakers of the Holy Ghost and have tasted the good word of God and the powers of the world to come, if they fall away, if they commit apostasy, to renew them again to repentance, seeing they crucify to themselves the Son of God afresh. The Greek says re-crucifying the Son of God for themselves and put him to open shame. So can we crucify Jesus again? That scripture says you can. When you decide you're going to just fall away. We've had a lot in the last few years, people who are supposed to be faith people who say they're walking away from the faith. Don't believe it anymore. Walking away. I got the truth. I got more. I'm smarter than that. Better be careful. Because you're crucifying Jesus again. And you're going to put him to open shame. One more thing I want to say here. Daniel has said, I think, before that it's important that you find yourself in Scripture. When we read Scriptures like, he's going, who are you fit in? Who are you in that Scripture? So I'll just ask you the question, of all these people we talked to about today, who are you? Where do you fit into this story? Because somewhere we fit into it, folks. Are you the many? Are you the soldiers? And say, no way, I'm just going to follow my heart's conviction, and I'm just going to do the thing I want to do. Are you the rulers? Are you the daughters of Jerusalem? Are you Simon, who got caught up in a whirlwind and didn't mean that to happen, but it did, and he just went through with it? It's a question you have to answer yourself. I can't answer it for you, but I will say this. We have a time, if we ever are going to stand up and be counted, it's now. I know I've heard this all my life. Jesus is coming soon. Jesus is coming soon. He's coming back. He's going to come again. And I believe he is. But I'm believing that time is getting shorter, folks. I mean, the odds are in our favor anyway, because we're down the road further. But you just look at things that are going on around us. And it's not a time to get frightful. We need to find us a Frady hole and get in it. So, no. You have to do like Jesus did and stand up and say, this is me. I am who I am. You may come after me. You may do something that you don't think you deserve. But who are you? And I encourage you today, we just talked about the memorial of what this means. Jesus went through a lot for us. And I think we need to be able to give it back to him and say, I'm going to stand for you, regardless of what the world says or what the people say or the people around me, even my family. Because your family could very well turn against you. I've seen it happen. Jesus' own family turned against him. But what are you going to do about it? So I'm going to ask you today that this is something that's going to leave with you to think about, because I can't give you an answer to that. Only you know who you are. Only you know where you fit into that story. And only you know what direction you need to go. I want to thank you guys for your attention. I appreciate it. I appreciate you. And pray Daniel will be back next week. Stand to your feet.